want to thank everyone for coming to the first event in the Core Humanities Speaker Series of the Spring 21 semester, held virtually and remotely, thanks to both winter storms and pandemics. This is the first of 5 scheduled events, or 4 scheduled events, that bring together scholars to talk informally on a range of topics. Today, I'm very excited. The topic will be women and work in the Middle Ages. And we're gonna have we have 3 guest speakers kind of informally talking about their research, cool things that they work on, material culture, and the activities of women in the pre-modern world. On February 25th, there's another event on medieval America. March 25th, Cooking in Wartime, and April 29th, 3 Laughs. And in addition to this series sponsored by Core Humanities, there is also Thought on Tap, and all of these talks and information on the talks are available at the Core Humanities website. So this is supposed to be informal, and I now feel like I've made it very formal by talking all formally. But we have 3 speakers tonight, and I'm going to introduce them individually very shortly, and then kind of longer introductions before each talk. We have Katie Bugyis, who comes to us from the University of Notre Dame, Sara McDougall, who comes to us from John Jay College and CUNY Graduate Center, and Anna Siebach-Larsen, who comes to us from the University of Rochester. And so since I've introduced Anna last, unfortunately she's actually going, or fortunately for us, she's going first. So Anna is the director of the Russell Hope Robbins Library for Medieval Studies at the University of Rochester. She does research on the history of the book and is currently the curator of medieval and early modern manuscripts and early print. And so Anna, please take it away.
Thanks so much, Ned and Brett, for inviting me to participate in this tonight. I'm really looking forward to it. And I was starting to feel a little bit guilty as you were talking, because I think what I prepared is a little more formal than informal. So I might just cut big chunks out of the middle and attribute all awkward pauses to me doing that. So, but I'm really excited to participate in this tonight and to talk with all of you. So when I saw the workshop title, Women and Work in the Middle Ages, I started thinking more about the work of studying medieval women and how our understandings, or rather constructions, of medieval women are imbricated in our work, the work that we do, whether it's the work for which we're paid, like teaching in a classroom, working in a library as a librarian or as a researcher, or our unpaid work in our communities and in our homes. And so what I wanted to do tonight is talk a little bit about one of my favorite medieval women, and then to interrogate myself and the story that I tell about her as a way of thinking through and making explicit the assumptions that underlie the work of knowledge formation that we do. So my work, by which I mean my medieval studies research, and not my work as a librarian, often explores, but sometimes my work as a librarian, often explores how the world is envisioned in 13th and early 14th century encyclopedias and compilations, and who is allowed to shape that vision and the means through which they do so. And much of my interest centers on how power is materially and abstractly manifested in the work of pictorial and textual organization and compilation, particularly in Anglo-Norman manuscripts, Anglo-Norman being the French that was spoken in England, manuscripts that are often instigated by and for women across social hierarchies. So I'll focus tonight on one woman, Joan Tattersall, and apologies because some of you here tonight have heard me talk about her a lot, and the world that she envisioned and the one in which we, or at least I, envision her. I'm going to share my screen. All right. Can you see the slide? Yes, no. Okay, great. So Joan Tattersall, pictured here on the first folio of Princeton University Library, Taylor Medieval Manuscript 1, also known as the Tattersall Miscellany, was the daughter of Ralph Fitzranulph of Middleham, Yorkshire, and she married Robert Tattersall of Tattersall Castle in 1268. The Tattersall family was deeply devoted to Robert Grosseteste, Bishop of Lincoln, who was also an influential theologian and philosopher. And Joan Tattersall commissioned this manuscript about 1280. And she's depicted in it twice. On this folio, the historiated initial opening, the Manuel de Péchier, and in this she wears the heraldic garments of her father, and she's depicted directing a tonsured cleric who could either be a scribe or an artist creating the manuscript. And in the opening initial of the Chasteau d'Amour here, she wears a dress with the heraldic garments of Robert Tattersall, and she's pictured alongside Robert Grosseteste, who is wearing his bishop's mitre. And here are the contents of the manuscript. It has several texts of religious instruction in Latin and Anglo-Norman, as well as theological and moral diagrams. So we've long known that women were key to the broad and rapid dissemination of vernacular devotional texts in England, particularly from the 13th century on. And scholars across disciplines have explored the connections between vernacular manuscripts and texts, and women, sometimes in the process of doing this, exploding and sometimes reinforcing the stereotype of male Latinity and female vernacularity. But within this tremendous body of scholarship, I think that there is still room for a more explicit querying of what such an engagement with texts and images, such as we have here, a self-presentation within a purposefully designed manuscript, means in terms of power, particularly for non-royal and non-religious women in 13th century England. By that, I mean women who aren't, say, nuns or anchoresses. Building a collection of texts, either in a 21st century library or within the covers of a single codex, is never a neutral, nor a singular or self-contained act. It is inherently political, by which I mean that it is always performed within a network of knowledge and power, which are conjoined products of the same social processes. Foucault argues that power produces knowledge, and not simply by encouraging it because it serves power or applying it because it is useful. Rather, that power and knowledge directly imply one another, and there is no power relation without the correlative constitution of a field of knowledge, nor any knowledge that does not presuppose and constitute at the same time power relations. All of that is to say, the ongoing relations between people, institutions, texts, generate regimes of both meaning and authority, or power knowledge, simultaneously. So in this, the creation and dissemination of texts, the weighting of one text more than another, whether you're putting together a manuscript or you're putting together a library, involves a series of dynamic power relations. And I like this framework because it lets us understand that Tattersall's work as exploring and constructing meaning through her choice of texts and images within this manuscript happens within a broader and shifting network of knowledge and power relations. So she's chosen a series of texts originally written for members of the secular and regular clergy. And none of the texts that she's chosen are really radical. They're not heretical. They're not going to get anybody in danger for having read them. Rather, they participate in the larger pastoral project of the 13th century to educate the clergy and ultimately the laity. But I think that it's interesting and important to note the rapidity with which they spread and the degree to which Tattersall herself depicts herself as responsible for these texts in this book. Her choice of these texts is a means of participating in the larger social networks within which they exist, and the relationship they posit and reinforce between individual and institution, a relationship undergoing significant transition during this time period. Her early adoption and championing of them helped to legitimize them as the central texts in lay devotional formation during this time within Lateran IV's moves to reconfigure the relationship between institutional power and the laity through a variety of means. So we can see the different strands of this social framework in this miniature that you've all been looking at for a long time now. We have Joan embodying the symbolic power of the Fitzrenal family. She's towering over the scribe. She's instructing him in what to write or what to paint, and thus she's claiming responsibility for and primacy within the manuscript. On the side of his chair is an ecclesiastical structure with 2 lancet windows and an oculus, which is reminiscent of the west front of Lincoln Cathedral. Through this visual echo of Lincoln, Tattersall ties herself to the city and to Grosseteste as a potential saint. He was never sanctified. I mean, he never actually became a saint, but people tried really, really hard to get him to be a saint, including the Tattersall family. He wasn't a saint, but he's still pretty cool. Through this visual, by selecting these particular texts for her own manuscript, in a sense, Joan Tattersall renders them private. They are, after all, in this context, guides for her own self-discipline and regulation. You could say even that she brings them into the domestic sphere. But nothing is ever truly private, as we all know too well, maybe. And the domestic sphere is always connected to the public one. In her choice of these texts, Tattersall utilizes her symbolic power, her influence and authority to construct established norms and values and to define legitimate standards and culture to further legitimize these texts as valid fields of knowledge open to lay women, a move that further accretes power to these texts as well as to the women like her who engage them. She becomes actively involved in the construction of meaning, and the significations of these texts are not bounded by their content, but are continually remade in a process involving an individual reader, the text, and their social context. We can see this interplay really clearly in the next initial, the Chasteau d'Amour section of the manuscript. And here we have Joan Tattersall and Robert Grosseteste in discussion. And I want to note here that he died in 1253, which was a full 15 years before Joan and Robert Tattersall were married. So they never actually met and hung out. But the initial does embody the centrality of Grosseteste's work to the text in the manuscript's entire pastoral project, his role in the public and private religious life of the Tattersall family. And by depicting herself alongside Grosseteste, Joan Tattersall claims participation in his authorial and ecclesiastical authority, while also lending her own symbolic power to this continued veneration. So she does this by concretizing the authority of the text and the religious and political authority of Grosseteste through her inclusion of the Chasteau and this opening image in her manuscript, in which they stand closely together, they're almost the same height, they're mirroring each other's glances. It's a visual dialogue between collaborators. And often when we think of women being depicted in manuscripts like this, particularly lay women, we often assume that, that those depictions will fall into the standard generic conventions of a female suppliant, or perhaps that of a donor portrait, but this resists such a reading. It participates in the same networks of signification as a suppliant image. We have the inculcation of lineal duty, a reflexive mode of address, the play between the inward and the outward gaze, the act of looking as devotional and efficacious. But instead of presenting herself as a prostrate suppliant, Joan Tattersall seems to be creating a space for a reader, a speaker, a director, an object of intellectual and devotional vision and cognition, depicted in the act of seeing and cogitating, under direction, but also as an autonomous creating subject, working within the overarching institutional church, yet outside of the physical and organizational institution of a convent or an anchor hold. So another way that we can think about this is also by thinking about Robert Grosseteste's own scientific theories of optics and perspective, and the way in which that also transforms this image so that when Joan Tattersall looks at it, she herself is being transformed. So that's a different topic of conversation. Well, it's really kind of the same topic of conversation, but it's another direction that we can take it. The point that I want to make, though, is that in both of these images, Joan Tattersall is depicting herself performing the work of creating this compilation, work that consists of delineating, reinforcing, and claiming a field of knowledge, a work that is relational. In both of these images, she is depicted as working with a man, whether it's her scribe or if it's the visual, textual, and performative dialogue and relationship that she is creating with Grosseteste's text and his cultural capital. She portrays herself as engaged and embedded in specific networks of power, an equal participant in a shared engagement with a collection of texts, a participation that legitimates and accepts these texts and their readers as valid. So this is where I want to take a step back to reflect a little bit on this particular narrative and the ways in which we think about medieval women in power and work. I've been thinking about Joan Tattersall for a very long time, mostly in terms of her participation in Grosseteste's scientific and theological discourse as a means of countering what I saw as a kind of epistemic injustice that we often enact against medieval women. And by epistemic injustice here, I mean, and I'm drawing on Miranda Fricker, a wrong done to someone specifically in their capacity as a knower. My concern with the narratives, the understanding that I've created about Joan Tattersall is that such a project falls into the same binaries that it purports to overthrow. In my desire to read against the stereotype that Grosseteste invokes at the beginning of the Chasteau, so at the beginning of his text, he says that it's basically for people who are ignorant, people who aren't equipped to engage with the discourses within which these devotional texts are situated. By pushing against that, I was not attending to the full range of relational power demonstrated by Joan Tattersall in her self-presentation. I overlooked her obvious concern with lineal connections as manifest in her dress and found myself resistant to the affective labor that such a concern with familial and emotional bonds might connote. This resistance is also an example of epistemic injustice and a demonstration of our difficulty with allowing for the full scope of the means by which medieval women exerted power. I believe that it's vital that we are transparent with ourselves and others about the motivations and identities that fuel our work and the points where we experience internal resistance or difficulty. If power is diffuse and everywhere, we must acknowledge that we exert power upon the objects of our research across time and space as we attempt to excavate and create the discourses in which these women, who are often the readers and disseminators of Anglo-Norman texts in this example, participated. To what extent are we aware and accepting of our affective response and our own embeddedness within a particular discourse, the power that we wield or fight to wield in our creation of knowledge as researchers? What are the motivations behind the questions that we ask and the narratives we construct? In terms of medieval women, have our recuperative approaches also frozen women's identities in time, reinscribing our own taxonomies and our own comparative valuations of women's work and identities? And do those taxonomies unintentionally replicate the terms of knowledge organization that we are attempting to escape through our own writing of women's histories? Joan Tattersall was aware that the organization of and access to knowledge is politically and socially produced. But how am I as a researcher, and now I also think how am I as a librarian, organizing and facilitating access to knowledge, and what are the political and social contexts and ramifications of the ways in which I do so? So to return really quickly to Joan Tattersall, her creation of this manuscript and her self-portrayal within the process of its creation is a testament to the manuscript page as a field for the exertion of power. She configures her relationship with ecclesiastical authorities in the institutional church in such a manner as to claim space for herself as participatory in her own religious formation, perhaps even the co-director of it. In doing so, she stakes a claim for the power of lay women within the formation of literary, religious, and social discourse, the project of envisioning and building worlds both interior and exterior, physical and spiritual, while also tying her family to the major figures and movements of the late 13th century, grounding all of this work in the cultural capital that inheres to the book as an object. Or at least that's the story that I'm telling about her tonight.
The problem with Zooms, as I recognize, is that you can't hear all the applause. But that was really fantastic, and I think a really wonderful introduction to kind of the rest of the talks tonight, but also I think to the topic at large of women in work. And I think asking lots of questions about it, not just about the material itself, but about why we're engaging in it is exactly what I'm interested in. So before we move on to our second speaker, I wanted to just remind members of the audience, wherever you are in your homes, in your cars, that if you have questions, please use the Q&A function. We will go after our three speakers and have a conversation, hopefully using your questions as sort of jumping off points, sort of broader and more interesting, broader things. It'll be great. All right, so our second speaker tonight is Katie Bugyis, who comes to us from the University of Notre Dame. She is the author of The Care of Nuns, The Ministries of Benedictine Women in England During the Central Middle Ages, which came out in 2019, so 15 years ago, and is the co-editor of 2 essay collections. Her work focuses on lots of different topics, but at the moment she's working on a translation and commentary of the largest collection of Latin saints' lives, liturgical texts, and chronicle events assembled for a community of religious women in medieval England, sainting the abbesses of Barking Abbey. So without further ado, Katie, please.
So I too want to thank Dr. Schoolman and also Dr. Rodriguez for this wonderful opportunity to speak with you all this evening. So I am also going to share my screen. So hold on one second. All right, I hope everyone can see that. Perfect. So this evening, I'm going to actually speak a little bit more informally with you, which is actually not my usual custom. I like to have everything really planned out perfectly. But I know that I'm speaking to both undergraduate and graduate students this evening. And so really my aim is to take you on the journey of my own scholarly formation, to talk with you about how I ended up studying medieval religious women, and also how I ended up studying them the way that I do. So I am going to get a little bit meta with you, a little bit differently than the way that Anna did. But I am really looking forward to the Q&A to talk with you more about these issues. So medieval religious women. So when I was an undergraduate, I ended up falling in love with the Middle Ages because of reading the works of Hildegard of Bingen, that great 12th century polymath, Benedictine abbess in the Rhineland. And I'm going to just give you a list of all of Hildegard's works for those of you who are not familiar with Hildegard's corpus. But as you can see, there was no field of knowledge that Hildegard was not interested in. She wrote 3 major mystical theological treatises. Those are the first 3 works on the list, but she also was really interested in natural science, medicine, biblical commentary, and questions about the Eucharist. And also she composed her own play and a number of chants and other things, and actually even invented her own language. So Hildegard was sort of my first entree into the Middle Ages. But as I continued to read Hildegard's work, and especially the scholarship on her, I realized that more often than not, Hildegard was depicted as exceptional, and that most religious women during the Middle Ages didn't quite sort of add up to or equal this incredible, really formidable Benedictine abbess. And so when I kept studying medieval religious women, I realized that there were actually several stereotypes that seemed to be the norm in the ways that scholars tended to talk about medieval religious women, either being steadfastly pious or unrepentantly naughty in terms of sexual activities, but other things as well, and also strictly cloistered. And what I mean by that is that most vowed religious women were bound, at least institutionally speaking, or even thinking geographically, to a particular place. And increasingly over the course of the Middle Ages, ecclesiastical men, usually bishops, but also even the Pope himself, would try to make sure that these women, these vowed religious women, would actually stay within the buildings that they had taken vows of obedience to. And so this is what we call strict claustration. But even more troublingly to me, especially after studying Hildegard, is that most scholars also thought that sort of the average religious woman was also mostly illiterate, especially in Latin. And when we're thinking about literacy, I'm not just meaning even reading a language, but also even being able to speak it or even be able to comprehend it when it's being spoken to you. The last thing that also really troubled me too was that most scholars thought that medieval religious women were strictly under the care of male clerics, especially when it came to the administration of various sacraments, especially the Eucharist, but also confession as well. And so as with many things, there are some truth to these stereotypes. There were women who, remained strictly cloistered within their communities. There were some medieval religious women who were also illiterate in Latin, and also some religious women that were strictly under the care of clerical control. But I, again, was really troubled by the idea that this was sort of like the prevailing norm for these various communities. And so in my scholarship, I really tried to trouble these various stereotypes and wondering whether we can think about religious women as being skilled in various arts, whether it comes to needlework or even the production of manuscripts, and also thinking about the various forms of literacy that they might have possessed, and also thinking about the various ways in which they were learned, the different types of books that they might have read, and the various fields of knowledge that they might have been interested in. And then also thinking about the various kinds of power that they might have exercised, whether as abbesses or prioresses, that is the leaders of their communities, or also thinking about the various kinds of secular power that they might have exercised too, in terms of being landowners and also engaging in various kinds of business and economic exchanges. And then also thinking about them as being independent in the sense of not being firmly under the care of clerical control, whether it be in terms of the administration of their sacraments or in terms of the kinds of business that they might have been engaged in. And then the last thing, and this really is the thing that has most preoccupied me in my scholarship, is thinking about medieval religious women as ministers and thinking about the various kinds of pastoral care that they might have been engaged in, both within their communities, but also to laity as well. And so the way that I have gone about studying medieval religious women and trying to sort of cut against these prevailing stereotypes is to actually take a more bottom-up approach to the study of these women by investigating their documents of practice. And what I mean by this term, documents of practice, actually sort of encompasses a whole range of different types of sources, from those that are more narratival in nature, like chronicles or saints' lives, to those that are more documentary in nature, thinking about charters or cartularies, or even the seals that would have been affixed to charters. Thinking about the various kinds of household records that they might have produced and used, especially thinking about inventories or cellarers accounts. So for those of you who might not know, a cellarer is a particular office within a religious community, and they were usually in charge of the food stores of the community. But also thinking about epistolary exchanges too. And then my own area of specialization is thinking about liturgical books, from psalters to prayer books to lectionaries and homiliaries, and then other types of books that these communities might have produced, owned, and used, and especially thinking about their library collections as well. And then finally, and I think most fascinatingly too, are thinking about death notices or mortuary rolls that these communities would send out and circulate among each other. And so the image that you see on the screen right now is actually the mortuary roll of Lucy, who is the prioress of Castle Hedingham in Essex, which is Eastern England, not too far from London. And as you can see here, actually there are three sort of panel illuminations that are here across the mortuary roll that feature the crucifixion and also Mary enthroned, but also Lucy's soul being carried up into heaven by angels. That's the middle frame. And then the bottom features the burial rite that must have taken place at Castle Hedingham. And mortuary rolls also would feature various prayer requests that were being made by different communities that were in the Castle Hedingham's confraternity of prayer. So just to give you just a list of some of the manuscripts that have most preoccupied me, I won't go through all of them, but just sort of the range of the different types of manuscripts that I study in my scholarship are featured here. Again, from those that are more liturgical in nature to those that are more narratival in nature to those that are what we would characterize as documentary sources. But in the time that remains, I just want to explore a couple of manuscripts in detail to give you a sense of how vowed medieval religious women carried out one ministry in particular, and that is women religious serving as confessors, both within their communities, but also beyond their communities as well, to lay people that might have visited their communities, either as pilgrims or maybe as patrons of their communities, or those that might have just been seeking alms from the community. So my first example comes from what is commonly known by scholars as the Book of Nunneminster. It was produced in the early 9th century at a community that was located in Winchester, which was the capital in what is now known as England at that time. Unfortunately, Nunneminster no longer exists in terms of the actual structure of the community, but through archaeological excavations, we can roughly make out what the community must have looked like in terms of its cloister, but also the church itself. And even a few burial sites have been recovered as well. But the Book of Nunneminster, what I find so fascinating about it is in the early 10th century, a confession form was added to the final folio of the manuscript. And what's interesting about it is the confession form that you find here is actually pretty standard, but usually it was recited among priests before the consecration of the Eucharist. And what you can see, so the confession form is up here at the top, and then what comes below it is actually a form of absolution that would have been performed in response to the confession that had been made to absolve the penitent of his or her sins. And I say his or her actually advisedly, because what's really interesting is not too long after these prayers were copied, another scribe came in the interlinear space, so the space in between the lines, to add, as you can see here above the word frater, which is brother in Latin, the word soror, sister. And then here at the very end, you can see the word peccatrice, which is the Latin word for female sinner. And at the very end, you can see the words et peccatori and sinner, but a male sinner added as well. And so what's interesting is this prayer was repurposed so that a sister could hear the sins of a male penitent. But as we can see, this prayer served two purposes: that it could be recited by a man or a woman, and it could be to hear the sins of either a female or a male sinner. Now, just to continue on, another prayer book that has really interested me is one that was made in the second quarter of the 11th century at a community called Leominster in the west of England. So it's located here. Actually, that is not Leominster as it existed in the 11th century. It was rebuilt in the 12th and also into the 13th centuries as a male community. But in the 11th century, it was a strictly female community. And it produced this really extraordinary prayer book that is actually more often than not very vexing in terms of my own scholarship, because it was actually in the collection of a very famous book collector in the 16th century named Robert Cotton, and his library actually burned in 1731, and many of the manuscripts that were in the library's possession suffered either fire or water damage, and this manuscript suffered tremendously, as you can see from the folio that's featured on the slide. But thankfully, through either ultraviolet light and other means like multispectral imaging, we're able to recover the text that still can appear on the page that's not either been cut out or destroyed. But in this prayer book, there is a prayer, Suscipe Sancta Trinitas, so receive Holy Spirit. This prayer is what we call an apologia, and an apologia was recited by priests before reciting what we call the canon of the Mass. And so that's all the prayers that are associated with consecrating the Eucharist. And what I find really fascinating about this prayer is that this apologia, a traditional priest's prayer, was repurposed for a female penitent. And you can actually see it here in the second and third lines of the prayer. Again, we see that Latin word for female penitent, peccatrix, and then peccatrice. And what's even more fascinating to me is that on the folio that precedes this confessional prayer, we actually have a rubric that provides directions for how this prayer was supposed to be recited. And here we see, and actually this prayer is in Old English, not actually in Latin, but this rubric directs the person that's supposed to be reciting the prayer that it's actually supposed to be recited during the offering of the Mass, which raises the possibility that not only is a woman reciting this confession prayer, but she is also potentially reciting it within the context of the Mass, which, at least looking at the prevailing scholarship on medieval religious women, especially during this time period, the 11th century, this is something that most scholars thought that women religious were definitely not doing. So just to think a little bit more with you here at the close, I guess some parting words that I have for you all is there is so much work that still needs to be done on religious women. And this work, as I hope I have shown you just briefly, needs to be done from the bottom up. It needs to be done looking at the documents of practice that these communities produced, owned, and used. Because only by examining these communities, these women in these ways, can we start to understand what their lives may have actually looked like. For too long, scholars, for the most part, have looked at sources written by men about or for these women, whether they be conciliar decrees or even saints' lives, that certainly are insightful in terms of thinking about maybe religious attitudes that men had about women, but in terms of trying to think about the ways that these women may have understood themselves and the way that they may have organized and lived their lives, they can be misleading. But still, I think during the Q&A, I would really like to think more along the lines of some of the questions that Dr. Siebach-Larsen posed to us as well, because certainly there's much that I still need to interrogate about myself in terms of the way that I approach these religious women and the certain expectations that I might have in approaching their histories, and whether or not I'm fully examining the various power dynamics that are at play, both within their communities, but also in their relationships with the clerics that were related to them in various ways, but also the lay people who were associated with them as well, from family members to patrons to pilgrims, and also to those in need who came seeking alms. So I look forward to having that discussion with you during the Q&A.
So again, you can't hear the roar of the applause, but it's there if we all shout loud enough. Katie, thank you very much. That was another fantastic presentation. So we have one more until our discussion, and this is a presentation by Sara McDougall, who is a professor at John Jay College of the City of New York, and as well as the CUNY Graduate Center, so the PhD granting body of that institution. She is the author of 2 books, Bigamy and Christian Identity in Late Medieval Champagne, and a book I personally love, Royal Bastards, The Birth of Illegitimacy, 800 to 1230, which I was lucky enough, I watched the birth of the bastards in some respect. She works on a number of really interesting issues, including extramarital pregnancy or false paternity events, perhaps, illegitimacy in the priesthood, adultery, prosecution, spousal homicide, writings on the family, marriage, gender crime. She is the co-director of a number of editorial projects, including a special issue of Gender and History, Marriage's Global Past. And also what I think is really cool, she's the co-creator of a website called The Middle Ages for Educators, which I will put a link into, which is a really wonderful resource that I know she's been working on all throughout this pandemic. But that's not what she's going to talk to us about today. So Sara, I'll let you take it away. Thanks.
I believe I am unmute. Hello, all of you who Dr. Schoolman and Dr. Rodriguez at least assure me are out there. I don't know who's out there, but hello, all of you. It's nice to be talking to someone. I'm told I'm not just talking to myself, which is something I have found myself doing quite a bit as I try to do my work in this pandemic. And certainly women's work has been a huge topic in this pandemic. I mean, the numbers of women who have left the workplace, who are afraid are going to lose we're going to lose their labor, that they're not going to return to the workplace. It has been one enormous problem. And then the other problem, of course, has been the uncompensated labor that so many women have always done. And this is an issue that really resonates in a lot of the work that I've been doing in my research on the Middle Ages. So I tend to flit around a lot in my research, as Dr. Schoolman's introduction may have given you something of an idea, but it's usually something to do with women and something to do with law, which has mostly meant court records. It's also, as a professor, I teach a lot of legal and gender history. And so what women worked on in the Middle Ages is something that's always kind of been in the background, and I'm really appreciating this opportunity to think about it more concretely here. I'm hoping this is this is going to get me started doing some more work on women's work in the Middle Ages, and I really look forward to any questions and comments that you might have to help me get further with it. So as I think came up in the introduction, I work mostly on late medieval France, but I've also wandered around to many other times and places. For my remarks today, I'm going to attempt to focus on the 14th and 15th century and Northern France, and what I've learned about women in work from looking at court records. I did not, it will probably not surprise you, find women at work in judicial courts very much, with one important exception that I will return to. But I first want to get at the larger idea that, that women were working a lot in the Middle Ages. And when we think about the Middle Ages and work, I mean, I don't want to assume I could know what would jump into your minds, but certainly it's easy to think about it in a sort of casual way and just assume that this was a man's world and that women were excluded from most professions. And in a lot of ways that's true, but it depends on how you're looking and thinking at the problem. And the thing about court records is people tend to say a lot of things in their witness testimony. They're often asked to describe what they were doing. And you certainly can't trust someone when they're giving testimony in front of a judge to tell the truth. But you know, there are more reasons to lie about it to an investigator about whether or not you killed someone than whether or not you did the laundry. And so if they're talking about doing the laundry, it's quite possible they were doing laundry, or at least they're giving you a plausible description of how they did the laundry. So we can make something of that. Most of the cases I'm working on now are related to my efforts to try to understand what happened to women when they got pregnant, when they weren't supposed to get pregnant. So women, I've been looking at women of every social category that I can find. So I start with some pregnant nuns. And I move all around to the peasant, to the queen. I will try to stick more broadly to the women outside the cloister, because we already had we just came from such a rich exploration. Although I will say that one of the more interesting things I've been learning about women in religious life is the possibility of their involvement in childbirth and childcare. Many of us are familiar, many of us in the out of the people I can see, at least, are familiar with the work of a wonderful scholar, Sara Ritchie, who has been finding these amazing pregnancy charms that were kept in convents and were quite clearly being used as part of an effort to provide help with a pregnancy, possibly for a nun, but also quite possibly for other members of the religion, of the community who might have come in for care. And certainly we know that there are a lot of hospitals in Europe where women could go for help with childbirth, although most often traditionally women would give birth at home. But we can see in the 14th and 15th century at least a lot of women who would have midwives from a hospital coming in to help them. And that is an obvious example of women's labor. There was certainly, at the time that I work on, a lot of respect accorded to women's knowledge of how pregnancy worked. And that was something that women would generally handle. And these same women would sometimes come in as experts in the courts that I work on. And so you could have a woman come in to determine whether or not someone was pregnant, because if a woman who had been found guilty of a crime was pregnant, she could not be executed. They might also even release her from prison, which is a policy that other times and places might want to consider. Anyway, I will not get into modern politics, excuse me. But there was a great deal of effort and care to look after pregnant women, and that included this expertise. These female experts might also be used with rape investigations, or if there was an allegation of seduction to help establish a woman's status. So there are these women experts in gynecology. There's also women who worked as midwives. Sorry, I said midwives already, wet nurses, which was extremely common and a relatively good way for women who otherwise didn't have the means to make money. But you find women working everywhere in the court records I'm reading. So their work would often start in the family, which could involve a lot of the obvious sort of cooking and cleaning and looking after animals, starting at an extremely young age and uncomfortable enough, often enough age for us. You see 5 or 6 year olds running errands and looking after livestock and helping with the cooking and being trained in various tasks. You can also find women and boys also being apprenticed at an extremely young age, either because they're orphaned or not, just because their family needs either for them to get the training or because they need the financial support. And so women were very often put in homes as a sort of domestic worker and from a young age, or various other tasks like laundry, like looking after animals. There's also a number of more elite trades that I've seen women engaged in, especially cloth work. The silk trade was something that women had a very heavy participation in, and a lot of cloth work, which is sort of traditionally associated with women, but women would also work in markets. Women would work selling all sorts of different things, really. And of course, they would be involved with childcare. Another sphere of women's work that is out there that we don't necessarily think of was sex work, which was sometimes quite formal and sometimes extremely informal. So prostitution in the Middle Ages was legal. It was considered better that there be an alternative to running around after honorable, respectable women, that men have somewhere else to go. And so there were brothels in a lot of places, and women could work there and then it also seems possible that if that there were opportunities to leave and to marry afterwards if they want. I mean, there's all kinds of more things that I've seen. And I forgot to look at what time I started talking, but I think I've probably carried on roughly long enough. I'm hoping that I just threw all of this out there in a way that you'll tell me what's interesting and I'll tell you more about it. And you won't have to hear anything more about the things you don't find interesting. So I will end there. Thank you very much.
So again, the roar of the applause. There are 33 other attendees. So although you can't see them, they're there, and I want to acknowledge them. We already have a number of questions, and I know that those who are ready to write, please throw them in the Q&A, because I also have a number of them. I guess to begin with, there were a number of there were two technical questions, Katie, for your topic. Well, the first one was about like translations of the Galba prayer book, or maybe not even a translation, but its availability. How available is it? That's sort of a technical question. And another was that it says it's a silly question. It's not. But how do we know that women might have used these prayers to minister? So women who are engaged in sort of like pastoral events, pastoral affairs, and were they found in convents or produced in them? So those are the first ones for Katie, and I figure I'll throw that out there, and there are more coming up now. So I'll let you kind of get started with that.
So I'll start with Dahlia's question. So Dahlia, the Galba prayer book has not been translated into English, but there is fortunately an edition of the prayer book that was made by Bernard Muir. It's called the Pre-Conquest Prayer Book, and it was made for the Henry Bradshaw Society. The Henry Bradshaw Society has done a really wonderful job in providing editions of a number of liturgical books that were created in England during the Middle Ages. But I'll note, and this is not a knock against Muir's work, because it's really difficult work working with the Galba prayer book. There are some errors with the edition, and so it's worth checking the edition against the prayer book the actual manuscript itself when you can. But I'll drop this information in the chat too, so that you have it, because I know that me rattling this off right now probably doesn't necessarily make a whole lot of sense. But to answer Jacob's question, it's not a silly question at all. It's a really, really good question, because it's actually sometimes very, very difficult to know whether women are making these manuscripts, whether they're using these manuscripts, whether they kept these manuscripts, and if so, for how long. And so these are all really difficult questions that I'll say sometimes, because they can't always be answered through really careful paleological and also codicological work. And what I mean by that is studying the handwriting in the manuscript, but also studying the way that these books are made, the way that they're put together. And so things that I tend to look for are, of course, looking at the text themselves and whether or not they feature feminine grammatical forms for the person that's supposed to recite the prayers. So that can sometimes be a clue whether or not women at least owned it, potentially used it, or even copied it. But some things that I also look for too are revisions that are made to the text. So seeing whether or not a prayer book, or whether a prayer has been revised for a female supplicant. So that sometimes can indicate that there's a special interest by that scribe to adapt it in a certain way. Sometimes there's helpful marginalia that will indicate who the speaker of the prayer should be, but that's often really rare, or maybe even a rubric or a kind of direction to the prayer that might give some kind of indication. But But there are also other signs of use that I look for when I study manuscripts. And this is why I try to make the case for studying the manuscripts in person, in the flesh, because there are signs of use that sometimes are not captured by microfilms or even high resolution digital reproductions. So wax stains, wax drops. Sometimes I'll even find little threads or loops that mark pages of interest. But sometimes there are even things that are in what we call the gutter of the book, so really deep in sort of the deep crevice of the book, that things are hidden there. These are all signs of use that I look for. But again, I mean, it is like this kind of like crazy detective work, and you go down all kinds of rabbit holes making crazy theories, where definitely you should heed Dr. Siebach-Larsen's call to interrogate your own sort of effective response and heading into these texts, because sometimes you really want to see something, or you want something to be the case, and that might not actually be true. So you always have to play devil's advocate with yourself. But thanks, Jacob.
I think Jacob is using it may not be Jacob, it may be someone else. I guess we could, all the panelists, I guess we can all see the Q&As. I keep forgetting that this happens. But actually, I want to go to Bretton's question, since Bretton, I also want to also thank you for organizing this. I know you're in the audience. And this is you're asking a really big picture question that I think all of our panelists can get to, and I'll want to throw that out there first, and then we can get to the other specific ones. And it's about power relations. And so Bretton is asking, what are some of the ways that thinking about power relations, either in the period when texts were produced or between us and our subjects, can help us better study and approach our study of women in the Middle Ages? And maybe, and Anna, I can ask you if you have a hot take on that, only because I think you have a distinct advantage, because you can speak to like a discrete individual, right? And you kind of also mentioned power relations in your talk, that maybe you could kind of lead us, if you wanted to, on this question.
Yeah, I was trying really hard to think of a hot take on that. Really, really good, and I think huge and fundamental question. And I think that it's something that all of us touched on in this, and Dr. Bugyis just, I think, brought up something that is really important, which is thinking about the fact that that there is a relationship between us as scholars, and I'm using the word scholar really capaciously. Anybody who's looking at, medieval women, men, whatever. We're in a position where we can create the narrative that we want. And so I think that thinking critically about the point of view of the scholars who went before us and what they were looking for, and thinking also about what it is, like Dr. Bugyis said, thinking about what it is that we want to find in the documents that we're looking at, what we want to see and what we don't want to see. And taking one step back from that, thinking about the documents that even still exist and why those might exist, and what documents don't exist and for what reasons. What documents did people who came before us think were valuable, were worth saving, were waste? What did they want to recycle? And thinking about why they might have valued or not valued a document. It could be because it was associated with women or not, but thinking through those kinds of questions helps us understand the ways in which how people in the past have thought about women also affects even just the very documentary record that we now have available to us to think about women. That was a very convoluted way of me getting to my point, which was we're always operating within a genealogy of documentation, of scholarship, of preservation, and none of the choices that have been made before us are, all of those choices are significant, and the choices that we make now are significant as well. So we have to be thoughtful about those, is my really broad, open-ended answer to a really good question. But I would love to hear what Dr. McDougall and Dr. Bugyis have to say about it.
Well, I can just very quickly say, although I'm going to have to get the part of my brain that's just sort of grooving, if that's a word we're still allowed to use in whatever year it is. A part of my brain's still grooving about what you just said, but I'm going to try to focus on what I want to say, which is that one of the ways I've seen a really interesting power dynamic in the court cases I work on is with the women whose medical expertise was requested in court. They were the arbiters who would say, this woman is pregnant or not pregnant. This woman was raped or not raped. This woman is a virgin or not a virgin. And their word on it was taken in a way that, you know, is really sort of interesting as a moment of, they also worked in impotence cases, I can't resist sharing. So they would help determine whether or not a man was capable of performing as a married man must. And so their expertise was also drawn on in that regard. It's always a crowd stopper. I'm sorry, friends.
So I really appreciate the question that Brett asked, and certainly I think a lot about the power relations that existed between medieval religious women, and especially the confessors, the male confessors that would come into their communities, because that certainly was the case, or the priests that would come in to say mass, but also the bishops that would exercise various kinds of oversight over the communities. But I think because of Dr. Siebach-Larsen's presentation, I'm thinking a lot about the power, of course, that I exercise over the sources that I study. And Dr. Siebach-Larsen's absolutely right that we definitely need to think about what survives and what doesn't survive. Especially the types of sources that I look at, liturgical books from England. Many of them, I mean, just liturgical books by nature during the Middle Ages were very ephemeral. They would often be surpassed, or they would be by when new rites would be introduced, or they would be worn out through frequent use. But also, of course, given the unique history of England during the Middle Ages with the dissolution of monasteries between 1536 and 1539, there was a huge destruction of liturgical books that were owned by communities of religious, both men and women, after that time period. So what does survive? Why does it survive is something we're thinking about. But something that I do think a lot about is, I think there is a particular reason why I ended up studying religious women, and it's that I was educated by nuns growing up, and my aunt was a nun, and I'm engaged in religious practice myself, and so there are certain expectations that I have, you know, about what nuns are like, you know, especially nuns post-Vatican II, so, you know, post the 60s, you know, and thinking about the ways that they act and also the ministries that they're engaged in. So there is always sort of this super ego within me that is thinking about, well, of course, there are the ways that nuns behave now, and there are the ways that nuns behaved then during the Middle Ages, and always making sure that there is a kind of critical distance between those two things. But I often have to like check myself again, because to think that somehow that these women in the past are somehow wholly dissimilar from the women that we have now, I think is also a mistake. And so I feel like there's like this constant dialectic in my mind where I sort of am checking myself in terms of the own expectations or desires that I have in approaching these texts. But also trying to create space to be allowed to be surprised by these texts too. And I think those are the moments that I delight in most as a scholar, when I have an expectation that it's thwarted by something that I just couldn't have possibly intended to see in the text itself. And that's when I feel like the past pushes back on me in those moments in ways that I think keep me humble as a scholar.
I want to just follow up on this. I think there's, I mean, it's not actually a direct follow up, but there was a question about women confessors. Speaking about being surprised of things, I was very surprised to hear that such things could possibly exist. And so the question is, who confessed to them, and who is known, and is it known what the penance would be, and were women more lenient in issuing peasants? And I get and penance, sorry. And I guess this also then circles back to kind of these issues of like, of women who are taking on, I mean, we saw with sort of Joan Tattersall, like taking on these responsibilities for their own salvation or their own kind of like erudition. So I wonder if there's a comment or a way we could unravel that.
So it's a really interesting question about the types of confessions that might have been spoken to these women. We don't really know, at least those don't survive within the prayer books themselves. And so we have no idea, I mean, what kind of sins were confessed and how the nuns ended up responding to them within the prayer books themselves. But in my investigations of these manuscripts, I often supplement them with actually looking at saints' lives and miracle collections. And the reason why I do is you get these really interesting moments in these texts where penitents of various kinds, or even people that are suffering from various kinds of illnesses, because illness was often associated with sin during the Middle Ages, that they'll come to the tomb or the mausoleum or even the reliquary of a particular saint and confess something, and then the saint or even a member of the community will intervene in some way. And so you do get a kind of sense of the kind of confessional practice of the community by looking at these texts. But these kinds of sins that are expressed within these texts, I mean, they range really, really widely, from someone committing theft or, someone taxing another person too much to someone murdering another. So I mean, there's quite a range in terms of the types of confessions that are uttered there, and we don't get a sense in terms of the type of penance that they perform, because usually there's a kind of sort of miraculous intervention because the person has made a sincere confession, that they're immediately healed or freed from whatever it was that was binding them at that point. But yes, I mean, just to follow on what Dr. Schoolman is saying, that whenever I present on this, it always comes as a big surprise to some people. It's often really interesting to see sometimes the pushback that I get from some older scholars who are absolutely convinced that this couldn't possibly have been the case. So yes, it's just really interesting. But Sarah, I see that you're unmuted, so I don't want to dominate though.
You're too interesting for me to interrupt.
But I'll open it back up to others. But it was a really great question about confession.
So we have two more questions in the queue, and probably only about 7 minutes. So we can kind of probably find this will, I think, dovetail quite nicely. So one of them is about Madison is this is for you, Sarah. So asks a question about unwanted pregnancies, about cases where there's infanticide, but there's baptism. So this is a very specific question. And so, Sarah, I guess I can ask you, have you heard any? Does this?
Yeah. So I've been working on a bunch of those cases. I have an article coming out, I guess, in August. It was approved over a year. Anyway, never mind, pandemic. Many moons ago. But so what you described, Madison, is relatively common, that that women who were caught having killed their infants, saying that they had baptized the child before killing it, is something that is supposed to have made it a less worse crime, because at least then they did something to try to ensure the salvation of the soul. But there are also a number of other cases where women claimed that that there was a stillbirth, and it was, of course, extremely difficult to know whether or not there was a stillbirth. And So that could also serve to mitigate. And then also just on the whole, most of the cases I know of, the women were pardoned rather than executed. There seems to have been, either because of the uncertainty or because of some recognition of the desperate circumstances of many of these women, in which, giving birth alone, after having tried to conceal a pregnancy was such that that the courts were not interested in executing the women, even though they had killed their own children, which was obviously something that was not something that a good Christian woman should do. So that is a whole huge, rich topic, a sad one that I've done a lot of work on. And if you want to discuss it more, I'd be happy to, over email or another time.
Excellent. So we can go from something that's kind of quite sad to something that is hopeful, or perhaps just more methodological, so which I think is probably better. And this is a Stephen's question, which I see that Katie is already kind of answering, about critical fabulation, and about kind of working notions of bottom up. And actually, he was mentioning this to Katie, but I think this probably applies across the board. I think all of our, and just to our audience, I mean, all of our experts who shared their expertise with us tonight are working in ways that are really not top down. I mean, I think even if you say like elite manuscript production, if you're doing it kind of in this other way, it's probably kind of, there are bottom up aspects to it. So I thought maybe it would be kind of an interesting way to sort of end our conversation, is about how do we approach this? How do we approach and give voice to what is like what is the silent majority in the Middle Ages?
I can start with both kind of a broader and then a more specific answer. And my first answer is that I think that a lot of the work that we do is speculation. I think that and I don't mean that in a bad sense. I think that we tell stories, and we want those stories to be truthful to the extent that we know that they are. But any story that any of us tell about anything always has a degree of speculation and fabulation within it. And that's what makes the records that Sara and Katie were talking about so fascinating, I think, is that level of fabulation that is in both the records that we have and in the records that we don't have. The other thing that I would say is that if you're looking for a story to tell, you can look at elite manuscripts and you can look at elite manuscript collections, but I also would recommend going to your smaller libraries, because you would be surprised how many libraries have, maybe their one medieval manuscript that might be the one legal document that somebody picked up somewhere in 1952 and donated to the library, and it's probably a will, it's something like that, and it is highly likely that it's going to mention a woman. And that right there can be the start of your journey in discovering that woman's life and what she did, the different kinds of work that she did, and the people that she did it with.
I mentioned in my comment that, in my work, I had never heard this term critical fabulation before. I love it, and I want to investigate it more deeply. But I think the adjective is really operative in that term, and I think that's what Dr. Siebach-Larsen was trying to get at, in terms of, yes, we tell stories, but in order to tell the story, all of us do our level best to try to recreate that world on the basis of the documents, the books, and the other artifacts that still exist from that time and place. But there's always a gap. Like there's always a gap in terms of how much we can piece it all together. I often use the metaphor of a mosaic and sort of putting the tesserae of a mosaic together. And there are many pieces that are often missing, but you get enough of an impression based on the pieces of evidence that you're able to gather what the whole may have looked like. But I'm endlessly amazed by how often various theories or proposals or stories that have been put forward about certain things of the past are turned upside down when something new is discovered. I'm thinking especially about this really amazing discovery that was made about 2 years ago. There was the remains of a nun that was found that dates to about the 11th, maybe the 12th century, and pigments of lapis lazuli, a really precious pigment, were found on her dental record, basically, and it has been proposed that she probably was an illuminator, someone that had worked painting manuscripts in her community. And again, this sort of like undoes a lot of assumptions, but again, the stories that had been told about what nuns were doing within their communities. And most people wanted to insist that no way would a nun have been an illuminator, period, but certainly wouldn't have been allowed to handle such precious pigments like lapis lazuli. So tell the stories, but know that your story might be untold, or at least complicated or changed in various ways moving forward. But I think that's the joy of scholarship, knowing that I may not have the final word on this, and that's okay.
That is so lovely. There's no adding anything to that except to say, yes, go and do and try, and all we can do is our best with the materials that we have, with our own interests and skills.
I think this was like a really perfect way to end what was a really wonderful first event in the Core Humanities Speaker Series. And so I have 4 small notes to just wrap things up. The first is I want to thank all the attendees. I want to thank you for coming. I want to applaud you from here. Although I hear you, I'm sure you're applauding as well. And thank you also for your questions. The second is I really want to again thank our speakers, Dr. Siebach-Larsen, Dr. Bugyis, and Dr. McDougall. It was really quite wonderful to have all this together. I finally want to thank Brett Rodriguez, who organized the panel, and also hope that you will join us again for future events sponsored by the Core Humanities program. And with that, have a wonderful and safe evening.